Hi, this is going to be my analysis paper presentation. This is going to be a personal bias paper. For my personal bias, I picked volunteer first responders, or more specifically, volunteer firefighters or volunteer fire departments. And the thesis for this is volunteer first responders provide inadequate patient care and worsen patient outcomes. So, there are many reasons why I believe so. Volunteer fire departments typically have a low level of licensure, whereas, there's ALS units, BLS units. A lot of first responders, or volunteer anyway, are EMRs. So, low funding. Most volunteer fire departments have super low funding, which is probably why they're volunteer, because they have not enough money to have paid staff. Long response times. If they're volunteer, they're working day jobs or just sleeping at home rather than at the station, so that causes longer response times. They have to get off work, get in a truck, go to the station, grab the engine, and then go to the call. That's way too long, especially in an emergency. They have less experience, and they have at times, a lack of commitment to the service. Sadly, volunteer fire departments are extremely common in the United States, making up about 70% of America's firefighters overall. 85% of the nation's fire departments are all or mostly volunteer. This causes the majority of America to be provided care by care providers who do not get paid for doing so. And because of this, the care provided is at times inadequate or not advanced enough to help the patient in a meaningful way. So by this, I mean some services are served by a volunteer fire department or some communities, and then they have a ALS private ambulance or a county ambulance. But the issue is, if it's a private ambulance service and a volunteer fire service, that private service usually covers a large enough area to where they get an adequate enough amount of calls to pay the staff. And because of that, there's usually a station that's centralized, and responding to one community might take 45 minutes, whereas another part of the community might take 10-15 minutes. And so these volunteer fire departments first respond, and if they're volunteers, they might get there at the same time, so there's really no benefit to them other than extra hands on scene. And then, like I said, unfortunately, the ambulance services are private companies which do not staff more than a few ambulances in rural areas, as it would not be cost efficient. Volunteer fire departments consist of people who come in during their free time. Obviously, unless they're a high school kid, they have jobs outside of being a volunteer firefighter. Because of this, these people typically don't have advanced medical training that someone who works in EMS full-time would have. If they have full-time jobs that are unrelated to being a first responder, they're not going to have a high level of licensure, because there's no reason to. Going to school for 17 months to become a paramedic and then go do it for free, it's just not reasonable. With the long schools that are required to become an ALS provider, it may be impossible for these people to attend school or work in regular jobs. Most volunteer firefighters are trained as EMRs, or emergency medical responders. This certification has a very limited scope of practice and could be of little help to the patient if no ALS providers are on scene. Having a full-time department would allow the firefighters to dedicate more of their time to becoming a highly trained medical professional. So, what I'm saying here is that the certification that is typically given out to volunteer firefighters, the EMR certification, is basically just super simple. There's almost nothing you can do. I mean, oxygen, some assessment, and CPR. But the issue is if it's a ALS call or a patient that deserves an advanced life support medical personnel, they're just not going to cut it. And patients' outcomes can be worsened by that. Having a full-time staff would allow the firefighters to dedicate more time to become higher trained. So if they're there 4 days a week, 3 days a week, whatever their shift schedule is, they can spend that time where they're not running calls, learning to become a more advanced provider. Volunteer firefighters have regular day jobs, which can leave the community underprotected. Because of this, when an emergency call happens, the firefighters may have to leave their job to respond, which can be a significant distance away, causing long response times and worsening patient outcomes. They typically also must respond to the station first to get the response vehicle and equipment before going to the emergency, which extends the time the patient goes without care by a large amount. So, you're coming from work to a call. First, you got to get off work, which may not even happen, or you may be way out of town. But in the event that you can leave work to go to a call, you got to drive all the way to the station, which who knows how long that could be, any amount of time. Pick up the vehicle, and then go to the call. Whereas versus a full-time staff being at the station when the call comes in, I mean, that could drastically improve a patient outcome just by having people there ready to go. Due to being in a rural or small community, volunteer fire departments don't receive nearly the amount of funding that they should. These firefighters are responding to calls with outdated trucks, old monitors, if any monitor. Sometimes they have a blood pressure cuff, and that's about it. And very little medical equipment in general. This can be bad if the ambulance responding is having a long response time, which can worsen patient outcomes. Again, having a full staff would pressure the community into having more funding, which in turn would benefit the community as a whole. So, what I'm trying to say here is, if it's a volunteer service and they're not paying their staff, they're probably not going to have the most updated equipment either. And responding to a call with outdated equipment just isn't good for the patient in general. Being in a rural community, the overall call volume is a lot smaller than in a big city. Because of this, volunteer firefighters have less experience running 911 calls than full-time firefighters a majority of the time. A volunteer firefighter might respond to 10 calls a month if he's active and not skipping out on calls, whereas a big city firefighter can respond to 10 a day. Experience goes a long way in EMS, and having a full-time staff within the fire department, the rural firefighters who don't run calls as often could train and practice more during the day to make up for the reduced call volume. Overall, volunteer firefighters make do with what they have. The little to no pay, the outdated equipment, they do their best. And there is some good volunteer fire departments, but this isn't adequate enough for the communities in the U.S. Most communities would benefit from having a full-time fire department, as it would reduce response times, improve patient care, raise the level of training, and provide much needed coverage for the communities. I think that living in a community with volunteer agencies is dangerous to live in and could definitely be the difference between life and death of the patient. Having an ALS department 20 minutes away versus a BLS volunteer department 45 minutes away can change the outcome of the patient and ultimately save the patient's life. So, by the community not supporting a full-time service, they're directly affecting the outcomes of the people who get injured or sick in their community. And I think having a volunteer service in your district is an inadequate care for the community.